Now, boxing legend George Foreman has died aged 76. Big George, as he was known, but a remarkable career inside the ring, winning Olympic gold in 1968 and claiming the world heavyweight title not once but twice, 21 years apart. He's best known for that famous Rumble in the Jungle bout with Muhammad Ali, which has been called one of the greatest sporting events of the 20th century, watched by as many as 1 billion people around the world. Joining me now is former WA heavyweight champion David Haye. David, thank you so much for joining us today. David, sad news. What does he mean? What does George Foreman mean to you?
He's a living legend. He was a living legend. So obviously today, when the sad news came in, and he embodied the fact that he lost in a high-profile fight against Muhammad Ali, and 20 years later, he then goes on and does the unthinkable and beats a 26-year-old Michael Moorer. When he was a massive underdog. Proving his greatness. And I've always been a massive fan. I loved his early part of his career when he fought Joe Frazier and Ken Norton and knocked those amazing fighters out who had beaten Muhammad Ali. And then obviously the big one in Zaire, Africa, with Muhammad Ali, the Rumble in the Jungle. He loses that fight, and he went at that fight as like a maniac. He had so much to prove. He really wanted to get out there and knock Muhammad Ali out. Muhammad Ali, did the famous rope-a-dope. This is him up against the ropes, allowing George Foreman to use up all of his energy. And he unfortunately lost that big fight. But, he went away from the ring for about 10 years, had a bit of a 10-year hiatus where he sort of became a minister. He had about 10 kids. And, he'll go down as one of the greatest ever fighters. What he's been through. I remember a fight with a guy called Ron Lyles where he got knocked down twice. He had so much heart getting back up and winning those fights. And I knew him in the second part of his career when he was the big, lovable Uncle George Foreman, with a grill. He had the George Foreman grill. Everybody knew him. Everyone loved him. Great personality. I was fortunate enough to meet him on several occasions. Always said lovely, kind words. And, he'll be dearly missed.
How much of an inspiration was he to young boxers coming up? Because he dragged himself up by the bootstraps, didn't he? I mean, he came from a very, very poor background, was involved in a life of crime. Boxing literally saved him from that to go on to this amazing career. How much of an inspiration is he?
He's a huge inspiration. He went to the Olympics in '68, got a gold medal there. 5 years later, he's the heavyweight champion of the world, knocking out Joe Frazier. So it shows if you put your heart and mind and focus into one thing, you can achieve great stuff. And as you said, he comes from very humble beginnings, and he was just his sheer will and desire to conquer his opponents that made him the force that he was. And then obviously, he lost a big one against Ali, but he then rebuilt slowly but surely, came back, and then the new version of the Mark II George Foreman came back, and it was he had so many magical, amazing nights. Here's him in Zaire, Africa, big character. One of the biggest fights, if not the biggest boxing match in the history of boxing. Shown billions of people worldwide watched it. I mean, James Brown was playing live. It was a massive spectacle. He was the man. He was the undefeated young man going over there to conquer, the famous Muhammad Ali. And it didn't work out for him that night, but he came back again. It shows how good he was. 20 years later, pretty much to the day, that he could then go and beat, Michael Moorer. Michael Moorer was a great fighter in his own right at Southpaw. He knocked him out. And, I remember George Foreman, I think he was about 42 years old, and he challenged Evander the Real Deal Holyfield after Holyfield knocked out Buster Douglas, who knocked out Mike Tyson. And he gave Holyfield one of Holyfield's toughest fights, and no one believed he deserved the right to challenge for the title. And he pushed Holyfield to the wire. I really remember that fight. It was a very, very tough fight for Holyfield. And then, a couple of years later, he gets another opportunity where people said he didn't deserve it. And he then pulls off. He lost every single round for 10 rounds. People were saying they should stop the fight. And he pulled that one right hand out to flatten Moorer. and he was a 2-time heavyweight champion at 45 years of age.
45, that's quite astonishing, isn't it? I mean, Fraser, Ali, George Foreman, these are iconic names of boxing. And as you say, the rumbling, it's the only boxing thing that's actually got a concert based around it. You can actually get the soundtrack. I've got the DVD here. You can get the soundtrack to it. With all the great soul legends at that concert in Africa. Do you think we'll ever see the likes of this again in boxing, or has it changed and moved on so much?
The game has changed, though. Back in the day, they used to fight significantly more often. Now you get 1 fight a year, 2 fights a year, if you're lucky, from a heavyweight champion. Back then, they used to fight 3, 4, 5 times sometimes per year in heavyweight title fights. Foreman had 82 fights by the end of his career. If you compare that to, the 33, 34 like an Anthony Joshua would have now, they fought a lot more. He fought in over 15-round distance, and it was a tougher game back then. But the good thing is, boxing now, with the insurgence of the Riyadh season in Saudi Arabia, there's a lot more money in the game, which means a lot of the fighters are now fighting each other. They're not fighting. They're not hand-picking their opponents. The best are fighting the best, and it's getting more like it used to be in the golden era of boxing, in my opinion.
David, just one final question. Obviously, the serious question I'm going to ask you. Do you own a Foreman grill?
I've owned a Foreman grill for many, many years. Since I was a little kid. It was a Christmas present we got, and it got many grilled chicken breast. It was fantastic. I think everybody's got one somewhere, and in the cupboard somewhere.
Yeah, we certainly do. David, thank you so much for joining us. That's former WA heavyweight champion David Haye. Thank you so much for joining us with a wonderful tribute there to the late George Foreman, who we lost on Friday night. Thank you so much for joining us. Tell me your thoughts about some of the stories. Did you ever meet George Foreman? Some of your memories of him.
Yeah, I had the privilege of meeting George quite a lot because he was a commentator for HBO, so he was always there when Lennox fought. And at one stage, it was sort of mooted that Foreman might have to, and Lennox might meet in the ring, but it was a fight Lennox never wanted because it was a no-win situation, because George was the darling of the American people and loved by everybody. And, if Lennox had beat him, Lennox had beaten an old man. If Lennox had lost, he'd lost to an old man. And we were at ringside the night he was fighting Tommy Morrison for a version of the WBO world title. And thankfully, Tommy Morrison won on a unanimous decision, on a split decision. So the fight between Foreman and Lennox just disappeared, thank heavens. But he was a really nice guy, a very humble man. And then to think, his next fight, he went in with Michael Moorer, who was 20 years younger than him, knocked out Michael Moorer and became the IBF and WBA world champion 20 years apart. And the oldest heavyweight champion in the world and the second oldest ever world champion after Bernard Hopkins.
Yeah, that at the age of 45, wasn't he? So, the rumble in the jungle, even if you're not, you're not interested in boxing, everybody has heard of this fight. It's almost the iconic era of boxing. Do you think we'll ever see the like of George Foreman again?
No, I think he's a real legend. He is voted the 9th hardest puncher in boxing history. And he's just a legend. I don't think there's anyone to compare to him. 81 fights, over 68 knockouts, if I'm not mistaken. Only 5 losses. 2 great fights with... everyone talks about the rumble in the jungle, but everyone forgets the 2 great fights he had with Joe Frazier when he won his first title, and then the rematch that went 5 rounds. George was one of the most feared men in the boxing ring, but outside the boxing ring, he was so humble and so polite. 2 different characters, Jekyll and Hyde is how I would describe his boxing personality and his personality outside the ring.
Kelly, thank you so much for joining us. That's boxing promoter Kelly Maloney joining us.